We will now hear from David E. Kaplan, a U.S. investigative journalist. David Kaplan has spent 30 years reporting on crime, corruption, and national security. He is the executive director of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. GIJN has nearly 140 member organizations in 62 countries. The organization builds networks, provides resources, and hosts conferences and workshops for investigative journalists around the world. Mr. Kaplan will give us some historical perspectives on muckraking. He'll take us from the progressive era discussed in week 1 to the renewed flowering of investigative journalism today. And he'll talk about the importance of nonprofit and foundation support for muckrakers. Mr. Kaplan will argue that investigative reporting built the foundation of some of the world's most prominent news organizations, such as the New York Times, even though muckraking didn't always lead to immediate social change. Does Mr. Kaplan think we can be optimistic about the future of muckraking? Let's listen and find out.
We are an association of global muckrakers. We come from a proud and now long-lived tradition going back more than 100 years to the American muckrakers in the progressive era around the turn of the previous century, but really to great watchdog journalists in 100 countries around the world who have fought to tell the truth and have dug hard to reveal what that truth is. So we're quite proud of that. Well, the amazing thing now is that this tradition has gone worldwide, and GIJN is an attempt to provide some cohesion and to strengthen the networks and the structures that have allowed this to go global in the last 30 years. There were attempts going back to the 1980s to globalize investigative journalism, and this is an era of fax machines and international calls still cost a lot. The Berlin Wall was still up, and so it was you didn't have access to a lot of countries. That means you didn't have a lot of access to data and documents to tell stories across borders. That really started to change in 1989. It was kind of a magic year for muckrakers. The Berlin Wall came down. Millions of dollars in international aid from Western countries streamed into former Soviet republics. And for the first time, really, the development community recognized that along with economic development and land reform and better schools, you needed an independent watchdog media sector, that this was as important as any other aspect of development to creating a just and progressive and equitable society. So that helped, and we started seeing investigative nonprofits, investigative journalism nonprofits in places like Romania and Armenia. These places still exist, so the seeds that were planted then have sprouted and done well. At the same time, you had other forces coming to the field, globalization generally. It wasn't just the Berlin Wall coming down. Email was starting in the early 90s, and then came the World Wide Web. You could move documents and data around at the push of a button. Cell phones, the communications revolution, the cost of calling overseas came way down, global trade exploded, and the world became more and more globalized, and the bad guys realized this early on. The bad guys went international a long time ago, and they realized that you could move huge amounts of capital, huge amounts of contraband, of people, literally at the push of a button. The good guys are finally catching up, and I include investigative journalists among that. It's taken us a while, and we're playing catch up, but we're finally getting networked and communicating with each other and breaking down these cultural and national walls so that we can cooperate on investigations and find truths find hidden facts that are increasingly global in nature. And then you had one other trend. So you've got international aid that has been streaming in. You've got the forces of globalization. And you had the rise of these nonprofits. Most of them were pretty small at first, and it started in the U.S. with really the original one was the Fund for Investigative Journalism in 1969, founded in Washington, D.C. by a political reformer. It was felt that you needed an independent base to give small grants to freelance journalists who were doing some of the most innovative work. One of the first grants went to a young reporter named Seymour Hersh to investigate allegations of a massacre in a Vietnamese village called My Lai. He ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize for that story. And sort of lost in that whole discussion about My Lai was the structure that made that possible. You had a small organization that gave grants to freelance journalists that were tackling the toughest stories in the world. And it was producing impact. It was producing real results. That was 1969. And then in 1975, you had the first professional association, IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors. One of IRE's first big tasks was responding to the murder by the American Mafia of a journalist named Don Bowles in Arizona. This is called the Arizona Project. And really, without the Arizona Project in 1976, you don't have the Panama Papers in 2016. This is the direct ancestor to these huge collaborations today. IRE brought together journalists from about 24 competing outlets, and this was never heard of. To bring all these different journalists together on one investigative project. And the cause was quite noble. It was to send a signal to organized crime that you don't kill journalists, that if you do, the cost will be extremely high. And it was. There was a 6-month series. It was had a high profile. It won awards. It cost indictments. People went to jail because of it. And no mainstream American journalist in the U.S. has been killed by the mafia since then. They got the message. It became like killing cops. You know, people in the mafia are business people, and they are going to go the path of least resistance. That was 1975-76. Then in 77, you had the Center for Investigative Reporting start in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is a bunch of idealistic freelance journalists who, similar to the other two groups, felt that you needed a separate, independent institutional base to support investigative reporting. These last two groups are coming, in the immediate post-Watergate era, and young reporters are frustrated because, despite all the attention to investigative work, the mainstream media is still reluctant to go after sensitive stories, to go after powerful people, to go after issues that they just don't see on poverty and lack of equality and racism. So I think all this is informed in an intellectual level by the civil rights and anti-war movements in the U.S. and so that idealism and that mindset is propelling the people who founded these nonprofits. So the Center for Investigative Reporting creates the first nonprofit news agency that it's structured like a think tank, but it's full of investigative reporters. And I had the honor to work there from 1980, 3 years after they started, until 93. And we really developed this model of having a philanthropy-funded entity that was going after these stories, and then you'd partner with mainstream media. We had contracts with 60 Minutes, the local NBC affiliate, and there's a lot of talk about sustainability strategies now. We were all freelancers. It never occurred to us that you didn't hustle for every dollar we charged for everything. And the center is still alive and doing great work today, and this is decades later. So the model has proved sustainable. More than that, it has spread worldwide. We now have, at last count, more than 130 nonprofits in some 50 countries that are doing training, promoting this kind of reporting. We've got training institutes. We've got centers and academic departments full of student reporters doing great work. We've got reporting centers. We've got grant-making organizations. All those go back to these three groups. So you had a funding entity, the Fund for Investigative Journalism, you had a professional association in IRE, and you had a reporting agency in CIR. Out of that, all these flowers have bloomed, and they've really been the engine in many respects of the global spread of investigative reporting. People deeply care about investigative journalism. They want to know what's going on in their societies. They want to know what's going on behind the scenes. And given the chance, investigative reporting can do quite well. Now, it's often a lost leader. It often loses money. It's time intensive. It's controversial.
Yeah.
You can have harassment and lawsuits. I mean, there are costs to it. I mean, here's the good news. Despite all the harassment, all the controversy, all the pushback, our ranks are growing. We have more people doing more investigative stories with better tools in more places than ever before. And indeed, I think that's why there has been so much pushback. It's why, at least in part, that we're losing ground in places, because we're pushing harder than we've ever pushed before, and that's a good thing.